Book 2. Let's get started, yeah? Chapter 12. In the Palace of Divine Might, Crown Prince meets Crown Prince. Shi Lian knew this ring must have been left behind by Huacheng. He held it in his hand and wondered for a moment, what could this be? When Shi Lian was still an esteemed crown prince, he grew up in the palace of Xunle. The kingdom of Xunle had always reveled in beauty, precious objects. Collectors who held aesthetics above all else were abundant, and the palace itself was of course glorious and dazzling. Golden columns, jaded steps, innumerable treasures and precious jewels. The noble children even played with colored gems as if they were toys. Shi Lian was thus familiar with the sight of riches, and from the look of this ring, it appeared to be made of diamond. But its shape was exquisite. Even the most skilled jeweler likely couldn't craft an equal to the ethereal natural beauty it emanated. Moreover, of all the diamonds he had ever seen, this stone was extraordinarily clear, shimmering like a crystal, fascinating and sublime. The scintillating luster made it difficult for him to determine exactly what kind of stone it could be. Still, even if he couldn't tell what the ring was made of, it was certainly an item of extreme significance. If it was found around his neck, then it had clearly not been accidentally dropped. It was most likely a gift from Huacheng, a keepsake. Shi Lian was a little surprised to receive a memento like this, and he smiled softly. He resolved to take good care of it, and to ask the youth what the gift meant the next time they met. All he owned was this broken-down shrine, and in it there was nowhere appropriate for him to hide treasure. After giving it some thought, he decided the best place to keep it was on his person, after all, and thus Shi Lian fastened the silver chain around his neck once more. After running around Mount Yujin and Banyue Pass back to back, Shi Lian lay paralyzed in Puchi Shrine for a few days. If it wasn't for the kindness of some overly passionate villagers who came with offerings of buns and congee, he would have probably stayed incapacitated for many more days. He spent his time thus, until one day, a sudden message arrived from Ling Wen. Return to the heavens at once. Judging by her tone, something bad was about to go down. Shi Lian could guess more or less what it was, and was already mentally prepared. Is this about Banyue Pass? That's right, Ling Wen replied. When you've returned to the heavens, come directly to the Palace of Divine Might. Upon hearing Palace of Divine Might, Shi Lian froze. Junwu was back. Since his third ascension, he hadn't yet seen Junwu. As the number 1 martial god, Junwu spent his days deep in secluded cultivation, or out patrolling the realms and keeping the world at peace. With his return, it looked as though Shi Lian wouldn't be able to get out of making this trip. And so, after only a few days of rest, he hiked up to the heavenly capital once more. The divine palaces of all manner of gods and immortals had been built in the heavenly capital, each with their own history and style. Together, they formed the great city. There were sculpted pillars and muraled buildings here, little bridges and streams there. There was a transcendent ambience in the air, and clouds diffused beneath one's feet. The heavenly court had a single main road, the Grand Avenue of Divine Might. Although there were many such roads built in honor of Junwu in the mortal realm, such mortal monuments were but a hollow mimicry of their true form in the heavens. Only this road, in the heavenly court, was the true Grand Avenue of Divine Might. Shi Lian walked on down the expansive road and headed toward the Palace of Divine Might. En route, there were many heavenly officials hurrying along, but not a single one dared acknowledge him. Truthfully, there was not many to begin with who would acknowledge him when he visited the heavenly court. However, not acknowledge meant no fellow officials would approach and walk with him or initiate any conversation, but they would still nod in greeting and give him basic due courtesy. But now, they were pretending he wasn't there at all, as if a single glance at him would get them in trouble. If they were in front of him, they would hurry away. If they were behind, they would slow their pace, leaving him a wide berth, desperately hoping his feet would carry him meters away from them. Shi Lian had gotten used to this sort of treatment long ago, so he didn't think anything of it. After all, he did just drag down the mighty, newly ascended General Pei Jr. It would be stranger if no one stayed away. Yet unexpectedly as he walked, a voice suddenly called out from behind him, "Your Highness!" Shi Lian was amazed at the call, and thought whoever had dared address him truly had commendable courage. But when he turned his head to look, the junior official that called for that highness rushed past him and ran towards someone farther ahead. He called as he ran, "Honestly, your highness, how could you forget your identity medallion when heading to the Palace of Divine Might? How would you even get in?" Only then did it dawn on Shilian. Of course the address your highness wasn't directed at him. There were quite a few crown princes in the heavens, so some confusion on this matter wasn't anything unusual. Yet, when he glanced over and his eyes landed on the other crown prince, he paused. That young man had strong brows, bright eyes, and a wide smile. This smile was vastly different from those of many other heavenly officials. It was pure and sincere, an added air of childish innocence to his handsome face. Although, if a less charitable official like Mooching provided comment, they would probably call it an air of foolishness. The young man was dressed in armor and looked exceptionally heroic. However, it didn't give him an air of a warrior, of blood and battle. Rather, it gave him an air of royal nobility, candid and radiant. Shilian froze mid-step and stared at that young man. The two in front sensed his gaze and turned back to face him. When the junior official saw who it was, his face dropped immediately. Shilian lightly inclined his head and smiled at him. "Greetings, your highness." The other crown prince was obviously the type who didn't mind the everyday details and didn't recognize his face. So when he saw someone greeting him, he immediately turned the sentiment with a brilliant smile. He shouted back, "Greetings!" The junior official beside him gave him a subtle push. "Come on, your highness, let's go! We still need to get to the Palace of Divine Might!" The young man, completely oblivious, could not understand why his subordinate would shove him so suddenly. He wondered aloud, "Why are you pushing me?" Shilian puffed out a laugh, and that junior official pushed even harder, urging, "The Emperor is probably already waiting for us. Please, let's go, your highness." The other crown prince could only give Shilian a confused look before turning to leave. Shilian stayed where he was as they walked away, and soon distant whispers from lower-ranking officials floated to his ears. "Well, that was awkward. The world is such a small place." They're both officials in the heavens. It was only a matter of time that they met. If you ask me, General Nanyang bumping into General Shonzhen is a more exciting affair. What's the rush? They'll all be coming face to face soon. Everyone's gathering at the Palace of Divine Might, aren't they? Suddenly, someone commented, "It's not just a small world. Take a look at those two. I don't like to make the comparison, but even though they're both crown princes, His Highness Taihua is truly noble. He would never do anything shameful like that, even if he fell from grace." The kingdom of Yong'an was more prosperous than the kingdom of Shinla, so of course the crown prince of Yong'an is stronger than that of Shinla. How the grass grows depends on the land it grew on. Simple logic. The martial god who watched over the north was Pei Ming of the palace of Mingguang. The martial god of the west was Kuan Yizhen of the palace of Qi Ying. The martial god of the southeast was Feng Shen of the palace of Nanyang. The martial god of the southwest was Muqing of the palace of Shonzhen. And the martial god watching over the east was Lan Qianqiu of the palace of Taihua. When Lan Qianqiu was still mortal, he was a crown prince, like Shi Lian. Not just that, he was the crown prince of Yong'an. The kingdom of Yong'an was the country that overtook Shenle after its fall, and the founder of Yong'an was the rebel general who successfully overthrew the imperial capital of Shenle. When Shi Lian drifted in the mortal realm, he had also visited the east, so naturally, he knew that the crown prince of Yong'an had ascended. As heavenly officials, it was inevitable that they would run into each other, so he didn't think much of it. Those gossiping junior officials, while they were supposedly whispering, weren't particularly quiet. If their prattling had been about anyone else, they might have been more wary of being overheard. But since this was Shi Lian, they spoke without fear of him hearing. Perhaps they even found the prospect exciting. So Shi Lian pretended to have heard nothing and casually walked away. Just then, another voice came from behind and called out, "Your Highness!" Not again, Shi Lian thought, but this time when he turned his head, it was someone who really was addressing him. Ling Wen, with dark circled eyes and arms full up of scrolls, approached him. "Everyone has gone to the Palace of Divine Might for the meeting. Be mindful once you reach the hall." Of course, Shi Lian was aware of the situation. "What do you think General Pei Jr.'s sentence will be?" "Exile, probably," Ling Wen replied. "That's actually not too bad. Not too severe," Shi Lian thought. Exile was considered a temporary banishment for officials who had committed crimes, meaning the length of punishment was negotiable, and there might still be the opportunity to resume their duty. If they were found on their best behavior, they might one day get fished back up, maybe in 30 to 50 years, maybe in 100 or 200 years. But to Xu Lian, this not too bad was, of course, based on his own standards. To General Pei, it would be a completely different story. Xu Lian remembered another thing. Oh, yeah, Lingwen. How goes the search for the boy with the human face disease from Mount Yujin? The one I told you about last time? Do you have any news? I'm very sorry, Your Highness. I don't have anything at the moment. We'll work harder on it, Lingwen replied. Even for a heavenly official, finding a single person in such a vast world was not an easy task. Although the heavens might make faster work of it than mortals, it was still more like 10 years for the mortal realm versus 1 year for the heavens. Xu Lian thus said, "Thank you for your hard work." By this point, they reached the end of the avenue, and a majestic palace came into view before them. The palace stood through the ages, yet it showed only enduring excellence, and none of its antiquity. Interwoven glazed tiles adorned the golden roof, layer upon layer, blinding in their scintillation. Xu Lian looked up and glanced at where Palace of Divine Might was written beneath the golden roof. The characters, written with power and vigor, were exactly the same as they were centuries ago, unchanged. He lowered his head and stepped into the hall. Within, numerous heavenly officials had already gathered, either in groups of 2 or 3, or by their lonesome, standing in silence. The only ones permitted to enter this hall were heavenly officials who had officially ascended, all imperial sons of heavens, or indomitable overlords, each bursting with spiritual might. They eyed each other up in silent pride and judgment, their splendor overwhelming. Gathered here, at this time and place, everyone held their breaths and did not dare utter a sound. Upon the throne at the very end of the hall, there sat a martial god clad in white armor. This martial god had a handsome face, and with his eyes closed and lips unspeaking, he appeared extremely poised and solemn. Behind him stood the expanse of the magnificent Palace of Divine Might, and beneath his feet there were pure white snowy peaks. As if sensing Xu Lian had entered the hall, he opened his eyes. Those eyes were obsidian black, but bright and clear, as if formed by the melted snow of a lake that had been frozen for millions of years. And as he blinked them open, the martial god smiled softly. "Shunle, you have come." Xu Lian inclined his head in a respectful bow and said nothing. When Junwu spoke, he was not loud, but his deep voice echoed through the entire Palace of Divine Might. All the eyes of the gathered officials focused on Xu Lian, and he understood immediately. It appeared that this meeting wasn't for discussing General Pei Jr. and the Banyue Pass scandal. The spotlight, it seemed, was on him. Lingwen approached the throne, dressed all in black and not sparing a word or a smile. She drew a line through an item in the book she was holding. "My lord, there are a few heavenly officials who are still on patrol in the mortal realm, unable to return." Junwu nodded. They have given me their notice ahead of time." Lingwen acknowledged the response, and Junwu turned to Xu Lian once more. "Shunle, I'm sure you are aware as to why you have been summoned here today?" Xu Lian still had his head bowed. "I can guess. However, I had actually assumed that a decision had been made on the matter with General Pei Jr. Just then, a lyrical male voice called out from behind. "How that matter will be decided is still hard to say." When Xu Lian turned his head to look, a martial god stepped into the great hall, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He walked toward the front. When he passed by Xu Lian, he stopped in his steps. The corners of his lips lifted. "Your Highness, I've heard so much about you." This martial god looked to be about 26 or 27 years old, graceful in his demeanor but resolute in his actions. Looking at his face, Xu Lian thought he was even more attractive than the statue he'd seen at Mount Yujin. It was the kind of handsomeness that could steal hearts, very much the charming type. Xu Lian didn't respond. He continued, "Our little Pei has certainly been in your care." "I've definitely offended him," Xu Lian thought. He returned the greeting. "You flatter me. I've heard more about you, General Pei." The words "I've heard more about you" were certainly not a lie. In the past few days, Xu Lian had skimmed through his scroll and briefly read the legends of some of the more famous heavenly officials. Among them was General Ming Guang, Pei Ming. The martial god of the north was skilled in battle, but the subject the mortals talked of with the most relish was his many amorous intrigues, the beautiful and the ugly, the stories left behind in wanton alleys. beautiful stories, had Pei Ming spend extravagant amounts of gold to save a famed yet pitiful escort from the brothels, prompting her to fall in love with him and henceforth remain pure and true to await his return. Ugly stories had Pei Ming travel 1,000 miles for a one-night stand with a married woman, etc., and so on. On some level, Pei Ming was an awe-inspiring man. After reading through his stories, Shilian thought it was quite unbelievable that after so many years, only one Shonji had been created from this way of life. Because Pei Ming was accomplished in both battle and in love, his rivals and peers alike took great pleasure in cursing him to die. Even better if he'd die from syphilis. But his fate was tough and relentless, and he never caught anything from the many flowers he'd plucked. He wouldn't die, and he'd even live longer than most of his peers. Until finally one day he lost a battle. Everyone laughed, thinking, "At last he's met his end." But then lightning crashed and thunder roared, and in that moment of imminent peril, he ascended to the heavens. Those who hadn't already died by his hand probably all died of outrage. After ascension, Pei Ming didn't change his way of life, and the scale of his tales of promiscuity only grew. From fairies and lady heavenly officials to female ghosts and demons, as long as they were beautiful, he would not hold back. Nonetheless, the charming ladies of the mortal realm still remained his favorite type. Many indecent love stories had him starring as the main male lead, and if it wasn't for Shilian's method of cultivation that demanded purity of body and of mind, he probably would have read a few of those books just out of curiosity. Thus, in addition to his role as the martial god that ruled the north, the mortal realm also worshipped him as the god of love. Even a number of heavenly officials would turn around and secretly pray to him should they bump into him in the heavens, hoping for some fortune in love. It had to be said that, although similar in sentiment, such a title was definitely more fortunate than Feng Xin's unwarranted title of tremendous masculinity. All the heavenly officials present in the hall were well aware of what both of those "I've heard much about you" comments meant, and many roared with laughter in their heads. After such pleasantries, Shilian said, What does General Pei mean by hard to say?" Pei Ming snapped his fingers, and a corpse suddenly appeared in the middle of the great hall, floating in midair. Strictly speaking, this floating body was just a shell. It had no primordial spirit, completely empty on the inside. But it was covered in blood from head to toe, so by any practical measure, it was no different from a corpse. It had a handsome face, but its eyes were firmly shut. It was indeed A Xiao, or rather General Pei Jr.'s clone. To have such a thing appear so suddenly before an elegant crowd of heavenly officials inside the Palace of Divine Might was startling. A moment later, Pei Shu was also brought in, but he still looked indifferent and apathetic, even with shackles binding him. His head was bowed low, and he was silent. "General Pei, what's the meaning of this?" Shilian asked. Pei Shu knelt down within the Palace of Divine Might, and Pei Ming replied, "During little Pei's interrogation, he mentioned something I found quite curious." Pei Ming paced halfway around Shilian and smiled. "I'm quite familiar with little Pei's ability. Even if his clone's powers are reduced and nowhere near the level of his true self, it's still quite competent and capable of fighting evenly with a wrath ghost. However, he told me that he was surprised to meet a mortal who was so strong that little Pei was unable to even withstand his attacks. Now isn't that curious?" Pei Ming continued, "And so I pressed for answers. It turns out at the time there was a red-clothed young man beside your highness while you were at Banyue Pass." Hearing the word red-clothed made all the officials present shift expressions, and they all appeared uncomfortable. But Pei Ming's next statement made them completely agitated. And this young man, in the dark, was able to eradicate every Banyue soldier turned wrath in a flash. Now, your highness, might you enlighten us as to who this red-clothed young man might be? If it wasn't a wrath, then it must be a supreme that could kill hundreds of wraths in a flash, a supreme dressed in all red. Anyone could guess who that young man probably was, yet no one wanted to be the first to say the name. Shilian cast a glance at the silent Pei Shu and replied a little unnaturally, "Really? I don't remember it very well. There was a caravan trapped in Banyue Pass at the time, and we spent a few days together. Maybe it was someone from the caravan." "That can't be right, your highness," Pei Ming said. "According to little Pei, you and that young man were unusually close. Not like someone you'd only just met, or had only known for a few days. How can you not recall such a thing? No, you're wrong. That was the truth. It really was only a few days, Shilian thought. Nevertheless, his face gave away nothing. Just then, from the sidelines, a white-clad cultivator casually waved his whisk and spoke up. General Pei, you've only heard Little Pei's side of the story. Little Pei has committed a crime, and he's currently in detention, soon to be exiled. Whether his words are believable is still hard to say, no? Then we shall see if General Nanyang and General Shunzhen can assist us, Pei Ming replied. Following his line of sight, Shilian found Fengxin and Muqing standing separately in the southwest and southeast corners of the hall. Fengxin still looked the same as he had in his memories, tall as always, standing extremely straight, his eyes determined, and his brows forever slightly furrowed. It made it seem that there was always something irritating him, but really he wasn't irritated at all. Muqing, on the other hand, was somewhat different from what he remembered. His face was still pale, without much redness, and his lips still thin and pursed, his eyes half-lidded. However, there was an aloof air surrounding him, one that clearly indicated he was interested in neither conversation nor the dispensing of compliments. He stood with his arms crossed, a finger on his right hand, tapping his left elbow softly. It was hard to tell if he was at ease or if he was scheming something. While the two were considered good-looking men, each had their own flaws. Hearing Pei Ming call them out, they both looked toward Junwu at the same time. It was only when Junwu gave a slight nod that they reluctantly stepped forward. This was the first time since Shilian's third ascension that he'd come face to face with the two of them. He could sense all the eyes upon them going wild with excitement. Wild was inevitable. It must be known that the Palace of Divine Might was the #1 martial palace of heaven, and those without the title of heavenly official had no right to enter or attend court. The first time the Crown Prince of Shinla ascended, Fengxin and Muqing were his deputy generals. At the time, they were only low-ranking officials from the middle court, without even the right to scrub the floors of the Palace of Divine Might. And now, not only could these former junior officials stand openly in the palace's hall, but their ranks were even higher than that of their former master. What a turn of fate. How times changed. The three of them looked at each other, eyes flitting all over, stealing glimpses at one another but swiftly turning away and pretending not to care. Who knew what the other two were thinking? However, Shilian had pretty much figured out why Pei Ming called them out to help. As suspected, Pei Ming said, General Nanyang and General Shunzhen have both fought Hua Cheng before. I'm sure they can speak with authority regarding the weapon used by that person. So the point of bringing forth the empty shell Asha was for the court to inspect its wounds. Fengxin and Muqing slowly approached the floating body. Shilian himself took a few steps forward to take a look, but it was splotched with so much dark blood that it was hard to discern anything. The other two, faces askew, took their time in their inspection. Finally, they raised their heads and sought to look at each other, seeming like neither of them wanted to speak first. Ling Wen prompted from next to the throne. Generals, your conclusion? It was Fengxin who spoke first, his voice dark. It's him. The scimitar Emming, Muqing added.